Can we win? Can we win? At first, a virus was just a small news story, a news story about a place far away. And then it spread. It spread across countries and across the whole globe. And before lots of us really realised just how serious it was a global problem. The situation went from being their problem far away to our problem right here. A full-scale crisis. A war against a virus. Seems like there's nothing that brings together humanity quite like a common enemy. And then there was the faint talk, and it was talk at that point, of a vaccine maybe being a way out. A future hope. And then that future hope became a reality. In fact, multiple vaccines. And a global army of experts and volunteers worked together against this common enemy, fighting back with the approval of that set of vaccines. And then as we are seeing the rollout, the hope increases. But the whole process is long. And it's hard to predict. And there are what might seem like setbacks as deaths continue to be tragically high. And meanwhile, the virus mutates and changes, and the energy to keep going starts to fail. And we ask, is this not just a war, but an endless war? And can we win? Imagine a group of people in the first century living in the shadow of the Roman Empire, dreaming of a better time, of a time of less limits, of less oppression, of less suffering, a time when they could be the people they believed they were made to be instead of being pressured to be somebody else by the empire machine. And as the years go by, their hope and their energy is chipped away day by day as there are some highs with the resistance to the mighty empire, but then the crushing, grinding machine reply that grinds them down again. Military might, financial might, power, seduction, promises, threats, propaganda. These people trusted in a God who in their stories had made them promises, had made them a people to partner with their God in a project, in a creation project, and to help put that creation project back together. But here at the end of the first century, what was the hope that they could hold on to? As they met together, huddled in small groups, spread across the ancient Near East, a letter is read out. A letter from a fellow believer. A writer we call John. And it was unlike any letter that I might have pinned to my notice board. It was so visual, full of images, full of visions, full of sets of experiences. A riot of symbols and ideas they would know from their Roman Empire. Context, the propaganda machine that had imprinted on their minds so many symbols and images of what the empire was about. And then alongside that, all these kinds of metaphors and ideas and references and quotes from their own sacred story of God in their scriptures. And as you heard these words being read out as you met in your group, these images would come to life in your imagination, and you would start to feel them. And you'd be moved, and you'd be provoked, and you'd be inspired, because these old, deep truths and realities, things you had actually heard before, things you'd known before, things you'd put your trust in before, had become things that you'd become numb to, things that you'd pushed or had pushed to the back of your mind in the face of the grind of the day-to-day getting by, in the face of all the opposition. John, in his letter, keeps using the phrase, "I saw heaven open." For the Jewish mind, heaven wasn't a place far away, high up in the sky. Heaven was where God operated, and that meant it was a reality here and now, with and alongside and around us, even though we couldn't always see or sense what God was up to. And through this experience, John seems to have had the curtain pulled back, and so he gets to see the reality of what's going on and how much more positive that is than we might imagine, and also how much more frightening the reality of the opposition is. At the end of his letter in chapter 19, John's described a beautiful scene of how God is working towards a time of celebration, a time of joy, a time when the struggle is over and the reality is like a huge feast. A party, a celebration, a wedding supper. That's what's to look forward to. But then as soon as he said that, he goes to a war scene. We were wanting to hear more about the feast, more about the supper, more about the celebrating. What's with this war stuff again? Well, this scene starts with a rider on a white horse. In ancient times, in Jewish culture, in the ancient world, horses weren't for pastimes, they weren't for hobbies, they weren't for sport, they weren't for farming, they were for one reason. They were for war. The figure on this horse is called all sorts of different names and descriptions. Faithful and true. Bringing justice and war on the opposition. These kinds of images are all words and phrases and ideas used about their God. Not faithful and true in the sense of the facts, but faithful and true instead of in the sense of being completely reliable. Their God was faithful. Their God kept his promises. Their God was just and brought justice in the sense of saving, of sorting things out, of putting things to right, of getting rid of all the things that gets in the way of this creation project. As you listen to this, it would be just as obvious to you that just as the lamb in these stories is Jesus of Nazareth, so too this figure on the horse is another angle on Jesus of Nazareth. Except this time he's not riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, which is a story you know about, but this time he's on a war horse. So this must be a different Jesus then. This must not be the Jesus we've heard about in the Jesus stories, because he's all about peace and love and turning the other cheek, not about war. Well, as we look closer at what John is saying or not saying, he says that this figure has a name no one else knows, and that's to do with an ancient idea that a name, knowing somebody's name, gave you power over them. So if Jesus has names that no one knows, he can't ever have anyone like the empire, have any real power over him. He's also known here as the Word of God. And anyone familiar with the Jewish scriptures knows that the Word is another way of talking about the presence, the reality of God and his way. The God who spoke creation into existence. There's a book known as John's Gospel, and the writer kicks that off saying that Jesus of Nazareth is the Word who was with and who was God. And then John layers up more and more images taken from descriptions of the Jewish God. The rod of iron that's mentioned comes from their book of songs and poems known as the Psalms, from Psalm 2 in particular. And that rod of iron can also be translated as the rod of a shepherd, a protective, to defeat the enemies of the sheep. And the treading out the winepress of the wrath of God comes from a set of prophecies in a book of hope called Isaiah, in chapter 63 in particular, where it talks about how God will efficiently deal with the things that corrupt his creation project. What these Jesus followers at the end of the first century are hearing and seeing and experiencing every day is the message that someone else, not their God, can sort them out. Someone else can bring happiness. Someone else has peace and control. And that kind of message is played out over the human story century after century as different kings and empires and rulers and others have promised that they have the way. The Roman emperors proclaimed themselves Lord of Lords. The Persian kings of their empire called themselves the King of Kings. Here, this figure has a name that is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the real King of Kings, the real Lord of Lords. He has no rivals. Forget all the false imitations around. Jesus is, for John, the real thing. And then look, this Jesus figure on the horse has a robe dipped in blood. At first glance, this seems like a fairly terrible image because there's so much war language and then there's this blood-stained hero. But hang on a second though. The battle is being made ready for in this image. It hasn't happened. So where is this blood from? As you listen, you know this. That's why you're part of this Jesus movement. John's already talked in his letters about seeing this figure of Jesus that he's experiencing, this living Jesus, like a lamb who had been slain. You know that in the ancient Jewish system, blood stains on robes were reminders of the priests and the temple system and the system of sacrifices that somehow represented how God could deal with anything that got in the way of the relationship between God and his people, God and his creation. And so the Jesus story has been a story of victory won by not a battle, but by a life and a death and a resurrection, by self-giving sacrifice. It seems to me that the blood on this robe is Jesus' blood. That is the heart of how God wins the battle against everything that gets in the way. By loving his creation, his creatures, his people, his children so much, he gave himself, the ultimate sacrifice. The blood is Jesus' blood. Remember this idea that heaven is not far away, that God is not far away, that God is here, that God is with us, that God is at work. And that's reinforced as John's scene here pans out, and from the figure on the horse you see everybody who is with him. He's not alone. The armies of heaven are with him. So who are they? Well, look back through John's letter. All the crowds in heaven that are described. The crowds in these images have all been made up of God's creation, God's creatures, God's children, all God's people. In this image of a time when God is putting everything to rights, these are God's people who have responded, who have resisted, who have followed, who have not been drawn away, who have not been destroyed, who have remembered who they were made to be. And that means these armies in heaven with Jesus are all God's people. The people who are listening to this letter. You and I. Jesus is pictured right at the start of Revelation as standing in the middle of all his followers. And here he is again, standing amidst his people. So we, Jesus' followers, are people ready for war in this image then. Well, wait. What are these people, this army, wearing? It says fine linen, white and clean. Now, I'm not a military man, don't have that experience, but it doesn't seem to me like this is how you dress for a battle. These are the kind of descriptions we've actually just seen for a bride, for a wedding feast, or for the priests in the temple, not for a war. So where is our armour? Where are our weapons? Well, it's interesting that as this scene then plays out, this crowd, this army with Jesus won't do any fighting. They don't have any armour. They don't have any weapons. In fact, there's only one weapon mentioned. And that weapon is described as coming out of Jesus' mouth as a sharp sword. And so the only weapon in this scene is the word that comes from Jesus' mouth. The words that Jesus speaks. The word of their God. The only figure in the scene who will do any striking down is Jesus. You see, for that matter, despite there being a scene of getting ready for battle, there is no battle. The enemies of God's project, all the cancers and the viruses and the corruptive forces and the false idols and the empty promises and the empires that promise a different, better, but actually a fake way, that are symbolized in so many different ways in this letter as the beast, the dragon, the prostitute, the Rome, Babylon, Egypt, the empire. They're all imagined as gathering here for a war, but then there's no war. Because in one swift set of actions, the beast is dealt with, the false prophet is dealt with, the Satan is dealt with, the dragon is dealt with. The image is that when God acts to finally root out the evil, to cut out the cancer, to eradicate the virus, to remove all evil, everything that gets in the way of his creation project becoming what it was always made to be, there will be no battle. It will simply be done. And then once that difficult final act of surgery is over, then the feast, the celebration that John is so excited about can begin. Can we win? We don't have to win. This God already has won. And he will do all the sorting out that he needs to do in his own time. Meanwhile, calling for his creation to turn around, to understand the warnings, to hold on to the promises, and to come back to who they were made to be. In the meantime, there is work to be done. There must still be day-to-day resistance, patience, endurance, a life to be lived, facing a common enemy. And meanwhile, like John, reminding each other who we're made to be, what we're made for, and that despite the reality of the evil that we all face, that at the end of the day, there's no question about who has won.